Have you ever been to one of those corn mazes in the fall? My county does them in October, in lieu of haunted houses. I've always sort of liked them, but I think I like haunted houses much better. I mean, it sort of makes sense why ghosts would haunt a house, but I could never figure out why a ghost would hang out in a corn maze. You know, unless they were killed in a cornfield or something, but I digress. I stopped going to them when I was a teenager. However, one October, when I was hanging out with my friends at night and drinking a bit, we started talking about the local corn maze. I claimed that I had never found them scary and didn't understand why anyone would do so. Well, my buddy Todd then dared me to go through the corn maze at night by myself. You know, since I wasn't scared at all. I told him the corn maze was closed. He laughed and asserted it would not be very difficult to break into such a place. I knew in my heart that he was right, so I had to put my money where my mouth was and take that dare. We hopped into Todd's pickup truck. There were 4 of us, and we drove out to the corn maze. It was about midnight when we finally got there. Now, I guess this is an obvious statement, but it was so different seeing the maze in the nighttime than the daytime. It actually looked so much creepier. It didn't have any of the people dressed up as fake monsters either. That made the atmosphere even more spooky. It looked abandoned and dark, so Todd told me that the dare was on. I had to walk the entire maze. He would drive his truck to the other side where the exit was and await me there. He and my friends had to promise me though that they weren't going to sneak into the maze and try to scare me. I wasn't exactly sure how likely they were to keep that promise though. I slowly made my way into the maze. It's important to note that the walls of the maze were large enough to not be able to see over them. Of course, it didn't take long before I began hearing noises in the maze. I knew it had to be Todd. He'd broken his promise and was following me. At first, it seemed to be just light footsteps, but after a while, someone began moving the corn stalks on the other side of the wall. Several times, I called out to Todd and told him to knock it off. I tried to let him know I was not scared, and nothing he was going to do was going to scare me either. I wasn't completely confident though. I'll have to admit it was bravado getting me through that maze so far. With the added noises, it was indeed very, very freaky. I did my best not to let it show though. My ego was determined to make it through the entire maze without going back or flinching. Then I'd confront him at the end. It was then that I heard Todd call out to me. He talked in an almost amusing, high-pitched voice. I can still remember the things he said. They were comical as well as scary. "I'm opening my knife," Todd said in a sing-song manner. I ignored him. "I think I'll cut a few corn stalks," Todd said. I still ignored him. "I'm gonna throw them at you to let you know I really have a knife," Todd told me. I still ignored him, but all of a sudden I was hit in the head by the corn stalk. "Now I'm thinking about cutting your face off." I tried to ignore him, but there was something about this voice that last time that unnerved me. All the bravado flooded away from my system, and I didn't know how much longer the maze was. I knew that Todd was somewhere behind me, so I took off and started running through the maze. I could tell that Todd was running after me too, so I ran as quickly as I could, cutting each corner as closely as possible. As I made my way through the maze, Todd continued to taunt me. Once I got out, I was no longer so freaked out by the atmosphere. I saw the exit. I ran out of the maze. I burst out from it sprinting. My stomach almost fell out of my body when I saw Todd and my 2 other friends standing right there in front of his pickup truck, which meant he couldn't have been the guy in the maze following me. I ran up to them and told them to get in the truck right now. At first, it seemed like Todd thought I was just trying to scare him, but when he looked behind me, he suddenly turned around and began sprinting. We hopped into the truck. He started it and took off. I caught my breath, and I told Todd that someone had been following me through the maze with a knife. He responded, and I'll never forget what he said. "I know. I saw him coming out of the maze behind you when you told us to run." I had a freaky encounter when I was in high school. Although this happened many years ago, I still remember it just as if it had occurred yesterday. It wasn't the first day of fall, but it was definitely the first day that felt like fall, if you know what I mean. I was in school on a Monday. I lived in town, so I walked to and from school. Upon first stepping outside, I noticed two things. The leaves had started falling from the trees, and there was a cold breeze in the air. The sky was overcast as well. I went back inside and quickly grabbed my jacket, knowing I would need it today. It was such an odd day. It's almost like I didn't really feel like I'd woken up at all. I guess that's the only way I can describe how I felt. Everything was just off. I couldn't really pay attention in class and spent almost all class looking out the window, watching the leaves fall down. I felt like it was going to rain soon. The clouds in the sky were very dark, and the wind was picking up during the day. It was during my 5th class that I noticed someone. It wasn't unusual to see people walking along the sidewalk in front of the school during the day. What was unusual, though, was to see someone pacing back and forth in front of the school. If pacing was even the correct word for this. There was a tall man, very slender. He was dressed almost like a hiker. He had on boots and a backpack and just kept walking back and forth. He'd walk from one end of the sidewalk of the block my school was on, turn around and walk completely back to the other side. He just repeated this over and over and over, several times. All the way till I was done with the class even. I found it so odd and even a bit creepy. It put images of him as a possible sexual predator into my head. I assumed if this was really the case though, he wouldn't be making it so obvious. I tried to just put him out of my mind as I went to lunch. He could just be a purely normal guy having a walk to think to himself or something. The first class after my lunch was also in front of the school though. Sure enough, when I went to my class, the pacer was still there. He was walking back and forth on the block looking at the school. I was surprised as I really had put him out of my mind. I would have thought that anyone else who had been pacing in front of the public school for hours on end would have been talked to by a passing police car or something by now. That must have meant they'd decided there was nothing wrong with the guy. I was still disconnected from the day though. This time I was less daydreaming though, and wondering what this strange man was up to, if he indeed was up to anything at all. I just couldn't get it out of my head for the entire time I was in that class. I don't think I heard a single word my teacher said. When it ended, I still couldn't get that weird person out of my head. I went off to my next class still wondering. After school, I had play practice. I stayed later than most of the other students to help another actor practice his lines. By the time I was ready to leave, the sun had already begun to set. The school looked completely deserted. There was a light mist in the air as well, although it had not yet rained. I left out the side door of the school and walked on the sidewalk that led back behind the school. I had to walk that way in order to get home. It was quite damp out, and the leaves were blowing hard in the wind. I knew I'd feel a lot better when I got home. Only when I looked up ahead of me, I saw what looked like the very same guy from earlier. The pacer was somehow still around, and he was walking on the sidewalk in my direction. I began to feel a little bit uneasy. Still though, I realized this guy didn't know me or anything. He also didn't acknowledge me, and didn't seem to look at me as I walked on. For some reason, he still made me feel very uncomfortable. I couldn't explain exactly why. I felt something so off about this guy, I decided to avoid him. I went slightly out of my way and turned on the street that led into the neighborhood beside the school. I wanted to walk around the block and get back to the street I was on further down. I was still feeling something uncomfortable though. I felt like I was being watched or followed perhaps. It was irrational, but I felt it so strongly. I turned around and looked behind me to check, only to be surprised that the pacer had turned down the very same street I was on and was now following me. I chalked it up to a coincidence. He surely just happened to turn down the same street as me. When I got to the end of the block, I turned right. When I'd gotten halfway up the street, I once again felt a need to look over my shoulder. Sure enough, he was still right behind me. There was a faint possibility it was still a coincidence. However, when I made a third turn and headed back to the street the school was on, he turned again. That showed me he was following me. Then, when the street came up, I turned halfway down the block and looked over my shoulder, only to see he was indeed following me. I decided to run back to the school. As soon as I began to run, however, I slipped forward on a wet leaf and fell face first onto the sidewalk. I got knocked silly. Suddenly, I felt someone grab me from behind. Immediately, I knew it was that pacing guy. I tried to pull away, but he kept a solid grip on my arms. I was basically still on my hands and knees anyway. Then, the guy started whispering to me that I needed a new arm. I didn't know what he meant, but he was really hurting me. I wasn't a weakling though, and once I'd finally returned to my bearings, I was able to flip over and kick him away from me with my feet. The man didn't even fall over. He just stopped trying to pick me up. Then he grabbed his backpack and held it in front of him. Opening it up, I smelled the most revolting stench I'd ever smelled in my entire life. He reached into it. However, before he pulled anything out of it, the porch light of the house we were in front of came on. A man rushed out of the house with an aluminum baseball bat in his hand and threatened the man to get away from me. It took a few moments, but he eventually put his backpack on and turned around and left. Once he was gone, the man from the house came out and helped me up. He even gave me a ride home. I never saw that pacing man again. I always wondered what he meant about needing a new arm and what he could have been reaching for in that backpack. I guess when I was growing up, I was a bit of an unusual kid. I didn't really like people too much, so I spent a lot of time by myself. My parents didn't exactly like me hanging out around the house by myself all the time, so they would always encourage me to get out of the house and do things. They pestered me enough that eventually I did do it, but the only thing they really accomplished was getting me to take walks by myself. After a while, I did appreciate it though. I'd honestly begun to enjoy my lonely little walks. I would walk sometimes for hours and hours, and just use the time to think about whatever was on my mind. Those days, I'd have to say that my favorite walks were in the fall. I could watch the leaves falling from the trees forever. I loved the sound of the dry and already fallen leaves crackling under my feet too as I walked. I liked having it cool enough that I had to wear a jacket, but not cold enough that I had to wear a coat. Most of all though, I liked that there weren't as many people out as compared to the summertime. Before I go on, I should explain to you a cognitive distortion that I suffer from. It's called mind reading. I know how that might sound, but if you're unfamiliar with what cognitive distortions are, they're mistakes in your thinking that lead to faulty assumptions. Mind reading is when you assume you know what everyone else is thinking of. For example, you walk by a crowd of people and hear them laughing, and you make the immediate assumption they're laughing about you. That's mind reading. More often than not, it's also completely incorrect. When I was 13 years old, I was out for a walk in the fall. I had been walking around for a very long time that day. Normally, I'd try to get back home before it gets dark, but I got way too lost in my thoughts on this day. Before I knew it, the sun was already going down, so I had to head home and real quick. I was on the other side of town walking down Central Street, which was the main road in town. All of a sudden, I saw someone walking in my direction up in the distance. It was a very big guy, wearing some raggy clothes. As usual, my mind went somewhere it didn't really need to go. I immediately thought the worst of this person. I wanted to cross the street, actually. This was a normal response for me if I saw anyone walking in my direction. I did my best to resist, but the closer we got to each other, the more uncomfortable I felt. I knew that I had to take what was in my mind and do my best to shoo it away, because I knew there was no real danger here. But as we got closer and closer, my mind started to play tricks on me. When we were no more than a block away from each other, I guess my anxiety about it got the better of me. I quickly turned and ducked down a side street, intending to cut through it to get all the way home. I felt bad for failing, but I felt better that I was now alone again in the street. I had ducked down. It was very dark. I lived in a pretty small town, so once you got off the central street, you pretty much have very little light left. Like I mentioned, I felt better being by myself though. I began thinking I had been jumping to conclusions. Actually, I felt a little bit bad about judging that random person. I didn't even really know them to begin with. I should have been able to walk past the guy. I was in thought about the incident, thinking about what I could do better in the future, when I suddenly felt someone touch me from behind on the shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive touch, but it did make me jump. Before I could turn around, I heard a voice whisper to me, "I'd love to buy all your fingers off you." I quit turning around and took off down the street. I really didn't need to see who was saying that to me. Whoever had whispered in my ear seemed to make no effort to hold me back either. I never looked back. I just ran and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street that my house was on. At that point, I finally turned around. I didn't see anyone there though. I never got a good look at who it was that whispered that to me. I can only assume it was the guy I'd seen on the street. Perhaps sometimes mind reading can be useful, but who knows? My mom was a single parent of 3 kids. We were pretty poor, so she worked pretty much 24/7. This meant that as kids, my siblings and I spent a lot of time home alone. Well, this story happened when I was 14, at the very start of summer. My older sister had moved out by then, and my little brother got sent to stay with my grandpa for the summer. This meant I was home alone from about 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every weekday. I didn't really mind too much though. I spent most of that time playing Neopets or watching awful daytime TV. Well, one day, I had not long woken up, and my mom had gone to work hours earlier. It was around 12 p.m. or so. I got up to make some food, let my dog outside, and settled down on my bed to eat a bit. I remember watching Rock of Love, and remember exactly the bit of show I was watching too when this happened, even though it happened so many years ago. As I was sitting there watching, I heard a loud smack on my window. My window was a double window that needed 2 blinds, 2 curtains, etc. This meant there was a tiny gap where you could see through the very middle of them, where they didn't quite touch together. I saw a shadow along with that sound. I also heard some logs falling down. Outside my window, there was a pile of firewood for the winter. I got up and walked over, thinking perhaps a branch or something had smacked against it, and that's when I saw it. A huge handprint left on my window right where the tiny gap was between my blinds. I freaked the fuck out. I couldn't even breathe. I was so scared. I called 911 and then my next door neighbor, who was a family friend. He ran over as soon as I said what happened, and he found the guy there still, a man in his mid-40s, sprinting out of my backyard into the street ahead. My neighbor tried to keep him there until the police arrived. When they got there, I told them what happened. They looked into the guy to see if he had a past, but nothing seemingly came up. He had been dating and living with another neighbor 3 doors down from my house for a few months. When asked what he was doing at my window, he told us he was never there. He was just looking for something. I don't remember his exact excuse. I just remember him saying it happened to be in my backyard. The police got a statement from him, and the neighbor who caught him and myself thought it would help to get him put away or something. I know, it's stupid, but I was a teen. I didn't know any better. They just let him go and didn't do anything. I waited to hear from them regarding next steps we could take, but I never got another reply. From then on, my anxiety was awful. I had motion lights set up outside my window as well, making sure I was never sleeping alone too. But it wasn't enough. I could never rest. Now I felt like I was constantly being watched everywhere. Who knows, maybe I could have been. How did this guy know I would be home alone? What did he want to find me doing? I felt so unsafe. Fast forward 2 months later. I'm staying with my best friend who lived across the street from me, and we were both in the shower. We saw a shadow walk up to the bathroom window. It was glazed over, so you couldn't see anything properly. I wiped off some of the steam, and who do I see? That guy from my window the other time, running away from the bathroom as I popped it open. I told my friend who it was, and we both freaked out together. We called the cops again, and again they did nothing. Worst part was, no one even believed me, minus the guy who'd found him the first time. My mom told me I was too fat for a guy to want to creep on me, and that I was just being dramatic. Nothing happened to the guy. He did this multiple times after, and I have to wonder how many others he did it to as well. The woman he was living with had a very young daughter at the time too. It still haunts me, though I guess it shouldn't. It just scares me. We can go on with our lives, and someone could be watching and waiting to prey on us, and we would never know. What would he have done that night if he hadn't accidentally knocked the firewood logs over? I'll never know.